So good morning everyone and welcome to our first panel discussion of the day. As Emma said, my name's Sarah Chapman and I'm a senior lecturer in journalism at the University of Derby. Now, you can go to the Asda and get some rotten tomatoes to throw at me later because we've swapped out teaching shorthand for teaching analytics instead. So I'll save the hate for later. So we're going to hear today from some people who've got some really interesting stats to share with us about those metrics. And we're starting with Anna Jays, who's head of digital, Midlands Reach PLC. And we're going to take those questions later. So if you think of a question, we'll do that sort of old school, all right? And I hope Anna doesn't mind, but we are going to be slaves to the clock. So I'm going to be hovering in the corner, and I'll tip you the wink when your 5 minutes is done. All right, so welcome, Anna.
Hello, hi everybody. So my job is to run the digital newsroom in Birmingham mainly, but also work with our newsrooms in Stoke and Coventry. But today I'm mostly going to talk to you about Birmingham Live. For those of you that don't know, Birmingham Live is formerly birminghammail.co.uk, but we relaunched in February of this year with a complete new approach and new structure in the newsroom, as well as a new name and a new colour. So one thing that we looked at that we really wanted reporters to work on were passions or patches. Now these could be areas of content, they could be geographical areas, but all of them had to be something that we knew had an audience need. We wanted to encourage them to build their own audiences, and we were going to give them the tools to do that. And we also split the newsroom into a number of core functions: live, patch and trending teams. But with all of those being so different, we knew that one metric wasn't going to cover all of that. One size wasn't going to fit all. We needed to think in different ways. So if we're not just looking at page views and uniques, what are we looking at? And for Birmingham Live, the answer is all of those things. Every day we look at recirculation, we look at uniques, we look at local audience. But the biggest focus and the biggest change for us by far has been a move from sort of the big numbers, the blunt figures, towards engagement and sort of mirroring a lot of those things that Jill's been talking about in the previous presentation. One thing that was really important to us was that data wasn't just sat within a few core people in the newsroom, and that data and that need and that sort of the tools to grow audience was spread out across the newsroom. And that meant that every single reporter had to be close to their numbers, and they've got to have an eye on where the data is telling them. To do this, we set up daily reports using Chartbeat. We found that they were really sort of qualitative in terms of their data. The journalists were getting a lot of information, not just about PVs, page views, but about engage time, about referrals, about social share and more. And that seemed to really work for us. It could tell them about their audience, and if we were encouraging people to build their own audiences, that was really important. It could also show them how they could build it. So tips and tricks, places where they were missing, things that they could do to increase their audience or just find out more about what they wanted. We also wanted reporters to think about their engage time. Average engage time is a huge metric for us in the newsroom. So often we need to match the right storytelling techniques to try and increase that or just to make it part of their radar. Things that we have done around that mirrors some of the things that Jill was saying around narrative storytelling, really telling the human story, finding that really improves engage time, and lots of other sort of tips and tricks, digital publishing standards, things that generally increase engage time. It also shows them who's sharing their content, which is really important for them, and also gives them an idea about what their audience behaviour is like, and crucially makes it easier to identify what content isn't working, which is often more important than what is. We also started to measure what we call high impact stories. So these are sort of the golden stories, the stories that really, really engage, keep people on an article for a long time, but they also attract local users. They're very important to our core audience, our loyal audience, and also they're widely read and shared. We found that this is a real mix. It's a bit of a myth about the fact that it's all sort of long form or issue-based journalism that's very engaging, but actually live and trending can be just as engaging. It's just about how you tell those stories. One example of that that we learned through high impact stories were around our live court coverage. So we know now, having done months and months of looking at high impact stories, that court blogs, live court blogs, are around 6 times as engaging for us as a standard court story would be. So by getting closer to our figures and seeing which one of these hit all 3 of those indicators, we can really move our content closer to what those stats are showing us. So we love a list at Birmingham Live, as I'm sure a lot of people do, so it'd be quite remiss of me not to do 6 lessons that we've learnt since the launch of Birmingham Live in Feb. The first thing that we learnt was that stats don't work if they're just in the hands of a few people. So if it's only the news desk, the key managers and the people that run conference that know about those stats, we're not really going to drive that audience very far. It has to sit within everybody in the newsroom, and there has to be a knowledge and an awareness out there across the floor. Reporters, I've gone from a 1 to a 1 there, I've just realised that. Reporters need context to apply data to their roles. So previously, I think we've thrown a lot of numbers at reporters and expected them to know what they are. That doesn't work. We really need to find the time and space to explain those numbers and give some context to each and every reporter so they can figure out what those really mean for them. What's not working is often much more important for us than what is. So every morning we look at the underperforming stories in conference, and we try to interrogate every story that's not working and figure out why that was. Was it the sell? Was it the picture? Was the social post not strong enough? What else can we do to make sure that that doesn't happen again next time? Something that I found really, really useful is that different metrics can motivate staff in more niche roles or roles that don't bring in those sort of traditionally really high numbers that we see from court or live. If I'm to talk to a parent, our parenting editor about big level numbers, page views and uniques, they're probably not going to compete with the likes of a big breaking live story or a big court case. But the fact that she's built up an audience on her own of over 10,000 people that are engaging with her every day on a Facebook platform, that's clearly valuable to us, that's clearly valuable to our audience, so we should be using our metrics to highlight that and sort of pat people on the back. We also think it's important to give reporters a forum to share those discussions. So we have a weekly ideas meeting where each reporter is expected to come and talk to us about what the data's told them over the last week. But it's really useful for how those people, how the reporters can connect with each other. There's lots of questions, people sharing lots of information and ideas, and then that takes it on to new content. What else can we do next time? We also talk to them about it in one-to-ones as well. And then the final point there is around data being used, not just to look at performance and getting much closer to our audience, but around each content plan. So every time we have a large event, something that's really important to our audience to cover, we absolutely forensically look at the data before we start. An example there is our coverage of Ramadan currently. We wanted to really know what people wanted to know about it. Our trends data, our trends analysts worked on it for a number of days to try and find out exactly what, and it's constantly changing, but exactly what people are searching for around that. We do that now as a project plan with every single event or sort of high audience driver for us, and we find that really, really effective. We should know what the audience wants to know almost before they start to search it, and I think that's where data can be absolutely key in your newsroom. And my final thought is just the questions that I ask myself to try and figure out which metrics we should be using. Page views and uniques are, of course, really, really important to us and have their positives, but sometimes I think we need to interrogate those a little bit more and think about, is that the most relevant metric to use? Should we be using something else depending on who we're speaking to? If it's a reporter, then most of the time that's true. Or is it more about what I want to know about the audience? I should be delving deeper to find out exactly what their search behaviour is or why they want to read our particular stories on social. And that's it for me.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thanks, Anna, for that really fascinating insight into how you use metrics at Birmingham Live. Next up, we've Danielle Dwyer, who's Audience Engagement Lead at BBC Digital England. Okay, thank you. Let's it's all set up for you.
Yeah,
there we go.
That's me,
Yeah.
thank you. Hi. So I'm Audience Engagement Lead on Digital England for the BBC, and I work alongside a team of subs and online editors and specialists. We're based in Birmingham, but content's coming into us from these 11 regions, newsrooms all over the country. So what that means is you could be sitting in Shropshire writing the story that's leading the BBC News website, which is great, but it means that analytics are so key, and it's important that we're all looking at the same data and we're all focusing on the audience and how the audience is consuming that content in the same way, and we're all using that information in real time. So I want to show you today a tool that we built in-house. It's called Telescope. And because we built it in-house, it's evolving all the time. So writers who are using it, editors who are using it are feeding back to the techies who are in the same office, sort of saying, have you thought about this, or I'd like it to tell me something different. It focuses on key metrics, 3 key metrics: reach, engagement, and recirculation. But it also tells us how people are finding our stories and how they're reading them, whether on their phone, whether they're looking at it on their TV or desktop, and where in the world they are. So we can do 2 things with it. We can look at one story and the data around that particular story and track the changes that we're making on the day, or we can look at it in a list view like this. And this is how I come to it every day, and this is how you would use it if you were an editor or if you were in a commissioning role. So this is a list, this is a snapshot I took from Monday, and what I was looking for was which of our stories today have got the best engagement. What you might notice about that is that actually the story people were staying with for longest on Monday was not a story from Monday, it was a story in fact from 18 months ago. It's about some missing boys, went missing 20 years ago in Birmingham, and they were coming to that from a link, a hardline link that we'd put in that second story, Carol Packman, because while the engagement was great on Carol Packman, the recirculation wasn't. So we had a discussion about which are the right links, and actually we weren't sure, and we added 3 links. That Milk Carton Kids was one of them, and so this was really useful an hour later to go back and say, okay, so this is now telling us that that was the right link. It sort of takes a little bit of the trial and error element out of it, and equally if we'd picked the wrong links, it would be telling us pretty quickly as well. The other thing I do with this sort of throughout the day is that top, the filter here where it says show me top pages, I change that to bottom and have a look for, and this mirrors what Anna was saying, stories that are underperforming and areas for improvement. So sticking with Monday, what that told me when I did that was this story, and this was the England lead, it was on 12 local indexes, and it was second story on front page, so it's getting lots of page views, but the engagement was about 20 seconds. It's a long story, there's lots of interest in it. We really hope for people to be staying with it twice as long as that. So that was about 7:30 in the morning. So we quickly changed the production. We put lots of UGC, we changed the images, but then we changed the production completely, and we went to this modular style, which is we often do with information-heavy stories, and really chunked the story up and made it just so much more easily digestible. And looking at Telescope, a view across the morning, it's clear that those interventions were really working, and we went from an engagement time of less than 20 seconds to, it peaked at 53 at about lunchtime, and I think the average was, 42. I think it was a little higher than that over the course of the day. So it's really about making us accountable and sort of, checking that what we're doing is working. And encouraging also in our writers ownership of the story, so that once it's up and it's live, that's really not the end of the story. This is the same story, and what this was telling me was we really needed better social sell, and we need to change our SEO, because just 2% of our traffic was coming from search. And obviously this is the kind of story, there's lots of anger about it, there was lots of social chat about it, and our story wasn't really doing the job in the first instance. So we're using it to be reactive, we're using it sort of for on-the-day intervention, but the best thing about the tool for me, and sort of where the challenge is and the opportunity is for me in my role, but just across all of our newsrooms, is how do we then use this learning to be proactive, and how do we take the lessons we learned on that story into our storytelling? You know, we learned that on Monday, what do we do with that then on Tuesday, and what do we do with it next week, and what do we do with it next time we write a story about trains? Or, you know, our first take would be that modular approach. So it's about really learning those lessons and sort of using them to move forward and think about it in our storytelling and in our commissioning and in our production and also in our promotion. And giving these tools to everyone in the newsroom at every level. So whether you're writing it, whether you're in Birmingham subbing it, editing it, or whether you're the person who's on front page in London sending the push alert, we're all working from these same graphs. Is that 5 minutes? Yeah. Good.
Thank you very much for that, Danielle, throwing up lots of interesting questions that I hope are sparking questions in yourselves that you can ask us later. Next up, we've got Mark Thompson, and he's Head of Audience Engagement for JP Yorkshire. Okay.
Thank you very much. Hello, so yeah, obviously as mentioned, Head of Audience for Yorkshire. My big role there is really making sure that we produce the right content for the web that's of interest to the audiences that we've got across 26 titles in the area. So I'm coming at this from a different angle, really. So I'm coming from my journey from words to numbers. So I started as a trainee reporter, working news, and I kind of got to know analytics by doing digital, really, just by putting things out there, seeing what came back. And as the analytics got better, Chartbeat came in, different tools came in, my knowledge developed, newsroom's knowledge developed, and we've all kind of grown together, I guess as an industry, we've all done that because our newsrooms, we've all grown together over the last 5-6 years. So, starting with one of my favourite subjects, the weather. So, when I was a reporter several years ago now, got less grey hair back then, but weather was kind of my thing, really. So Joy Yates, I think, is here, who was my first editor over there. And I realised that by doing weather stories, putting them out there, I got a lot of page views, I got a lot of comments on social media, I got a lot of shares. And the more weather stories I did, the more interaction it got. It wasn't just page views, it was actually people hanging around, commenting, sending photos in, sending their videos in. And this is kind of before, really, that all these analytics came in. All I was seeing was the next day page views, really. I wasn't seeing any engagement scores of Times, and definitely not Chartbeat in live terms. But I could see in a fairly kind of paper-focused newsroom that this was obviously something pretty big and something we should be doing. But it wasn't just weather, it was things such as bin collections, road closures, Ofsted reports, all the things that we know across our newsrooms really drive audience. They have huge interest, and we do it day to day in the newspapers, but we probably weren't that great at it online. And one of the reasons why was these comments, which I think Keith mentioned the grey cardigans earlier on, and I'm sure everyone recognises these comments. Sometimes this is true. Sometimes we are a bit clickbaity. We try not to be in Yorkshire. We always try to deliver on what we promise, which is one of the key things that I try and push. But I think the way that the industry's changed causes confusion. It makes people kind of doubt what we're doing and wonder why we're doing it, because it's very different from how the newspapers used to work. But I found that by using analytics and using the metrics, it gives clarity. So we can use that to show actually our audience want the story. They need to know about the story. They've got a varied interest. It's not just about the hard news. We don't do cat stories, sadly, but we do a lot of weather and service journalism, things that affects people's daily lives on top of the news. And a lot of this came from what we've always done. As an industry, media has always been really varied. So you can go down the supermarket aisle, you'll see cats, you'll see newspapers, you'll see fitness fads, you'll see celebrities, you'll see car magazines. The beauty of digital is that we can do all that. We can do all that on one platform. So while we are heavily news focused, the metrics show that we can actually bring more value to people's lives. That's all fairly basic, really, but that was kind of just my very, very brief journey into what I do now, from being a trainee reporter to being head of audience for Yorkshire. So now, really, many people say, because I'm obsessed by the numbers, that I'm the saddest man in the newsroom. And I also say, yeah, because SAD is really important. What we do is supply and demand. People need to know the information. When we put stories out there, we can track it. We can make sure that people are interested, that people are engaged with it, that they are clicking around the site, all the metrics talked about earlier. But we can also create new platforms within the platforms that we currently have. So on there is Leeds City Buzz, which is something that we've revamped recently because we know in Leeds City Centre there's a big interest in kind of the cocktail bars, things in Leeds City Centre, hotels, where to stay, things that people are searching for on Google, things that people come directly to us to look at, and we can make sure that by having all that content in one place, we can try and build a key audience that is separate from the news. So we know that some people want to read hard news, we know by looking at the metrics, but we also know that some people just want to know what's happening in Leeds in terms of lifestyle. I've added this slide in because I think this shows kind of over time that my ideas back when I was doing weather stories haven't really changed. The top stories this is top stories for page views and engagement comparisons on the Yorkshire Post the last couple of months are the things that really affect people's lives. Weather, bin collections, road closures for the Tour de Yorkshire, driving, prescription medicines, things that people want to know, things that people are searching for, things that people come to our site for and clicking through. So in the newsroom, I had a bit of a wander around the newsroom a couple of days ago and just asked people really what they thought about the metrics that we use now. So you can see from this that people are using the metrics for different reasons. They're using it to kind of A/B test headlines to see what works for them. They're using it to take Sharpie to see what's spiking and how they can follow things up. So there's no one size fits all. The live team will use metrics differently to the features team, different ways, but both just as important. And what, to me, it breaks down to three categories really. It's reactive, so as with Sharpie, it's kind of spotting those articles that are spiking, what we can do with those, where that audience is coming from, whether it's coming from Google, whether it's coming from social media, how we can increase that audience, how we can make sure that the headlines are treated for certain reasons. It's not just about the metrics on our website, but it's also metrics with things like Google to make sure that we are hitting those keywords. Reflective, in a way that we can then sit back and think, right, what did we do? Was it a good job? Could we change next time? Could we learn from this experience? And then being proactive and thinking about, right, so this story spiked this time, but next time that something like this happens, are we ready for it? Do we have a set plan in play? Do we have a playbook that we can go into and say, when a story like this happens, what is our key 5 stories after that? And that comes to my next point, which I think is the most important thing with metrics by far, is coaching. I think it was mentioned earlier that, I think it was Jill mentioned earlier that the metrics are really important. We can all see the data, but it's really how we use that data. And that comes down to the people that use it. So it's making sure that people are aware of it, they know what the data means, what engagement means, why page views are important, why unique users are important, but also how they can help get people going around the site and recirculating. And a big part of that is personality. So we know what keywords work, we know what type of content works, but as mentioned before, sometimes it's just that little human twist to a headline, or to a story, or to an image that will make the biggest difference. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you so much, Mark, for that. So our next speaker is Ashley Franchino, and she's Senior Customer Services Manager at Chartbeat, who we've heard a lot about today, and it's great. Yeah, it's great. So let's hear some more from Ashley.
So good morning, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having us, and thanks for listening to so much about Chartbeat today. It's really incredible. I have the privilege of working with a lot of folks in this room, but since Chartbeat is based in New York, I don't always get to meet folks face to face. So it's really great to start to put some faces behind the emails and the phone calls that I take on a daily basis. So I've been with Chartbeat for a little over 2 years now, and it is such a privilege to work with some of the organizations that we have the opportunity to partner with. And one of my favorite parts about my role as a customer success manager is that it plugs me directly into some of the most influential newsrooms in the world, many of whom are represented today. And I get to see firsthand as a witness how these organizations who are so sophisticated go about building digital audiences online. And really the crux of my role is to help them take some of the data from Chartbeat and really turn it into actionable, tangible strategies that help them build and develop that loyal audience that we've been talking so much about. And I find that really with working with journalists one-on-one and working with frontline editors, we can really make a difference by just implementing a couple of changes, to Jill's point. And I really strive to help them contextualize the actual readers behind those metrics, because truly it's not all about the numbers. So that's a little bit about me. Like I said, you've heard kind of ad nauseum about Chartbeat today, but I'll repeat some of these things. We are an incredibly global organization. We work with 50,000 sites across the world. We are in 65 countries and on 6 out of 7 continents. There is one publisher in Antarctica, the Antarctic Sun, who has politely declined Chartbeat many times, but our CEO still tries to bump this number up to 7. So maybe at the next Behind Local News conference that will have changed. But I think really the benefit of casting such a wide net and being so global is that it truly gives us a bird's eye view of what's happening in the publishing industry at large. Many of those trends you saw Jill present earlier today. But we take that research around the road, and we also do research in other capacities. So we work one-on-one with publishers to answer questions like, how does my football traffic compare to the rest of the publishers in the Chartbeat network? And much of that research has uncovered many of the key themes, but one that really particularly stands out to me personally, as I've been privileged enough to be involved in some of these projects, is that a critical part of building a loyal, sustainable, captivated, and engaged audience is to start evaluating content against a blended benchmark. So really thinking about metrics from different angles and pairing those traditional metrics that we're used to using, like page views and uniques, with more sophisticated metrics that get to the heart of reader behavior. So truly balancing the quality component with the traffic component that of course we have to care about, will really illuminate the impact that an article has truly had on your readers and can help us quantify more accurately the value of that article to your news outlet. And I think until we start doing those things, we aren't really putting ourselves in an advantageous position to understand our reader patterns. So what is good for one story, what's good performance for a breaking news brief, may not be what's good performance for an enterprise piece of content that took us 6 months to report. And I think we need to keep that in mind so that we are evaluating our stories fairly and truly being able to quantify that impact. And so I think Anna really touched on this point that it's a nuanced benchmark for each story type, each kind of content vertical, and it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And I think really though for us, one thing that should always be considered in your metric set is engagement. And I don't want to beat you over the head with engagement, but it really matters, which is why we show this slide in basically every training we do and almost every meeting I'm in. We pull up the fact that all of our research points to the longer you can keep someone engaged on their first visit, the more likely they are to build that loyalty habit that's so important for us to continue to build our business upon. And so, truly we repeat this study every single year. Chartbeat has been around for 9 years, and it's held true time and time again. And again, not to depress you, but here it is, the sad slide. It's critical because we're seeing that 45% of visitors who land on an article don't go on to read, and they're probably not coming back in the next week. And so when we start to evaluate content through that blended lens, if I look at a story that has tons of page views, but it has very low engagement, we can use the metrics to start to ask better questions. What is the value of that piece of content? What does it mean to get one click and have people go back to the platform that they probably found us from? Until we can start asking those questions, that's when we can start to take action and tweak the story appropriately before our audience has moved on. So I think it's clear that when you start to pair engagement alongside those traditional metrics that we're used to using, that's when you really start to unlock opportunities. And quality content paired with strong news judgment, and that's evaluated fairly and justly, has been the lever that has really moved the needle for a lot of the newsrooms that we work with.
Thank you, Ashley. Please don't apologise for that sad slide. We need to know this stuff. Okay, so our final speaker on today's panel is Andy Martin, who is editor of the Bournemouth Echo.
Good morning. I think I've probably drawn the short straw here because speaking after all these guys, and particularly after the global context of Chartbeat, I'm going to be talking about business. So I will be watching for anybody's eyes glazing over, and specifically on local business. I'm sure we've all experienced similar things with regard to business coverage in our various organisations. Trying to make business coverage engaging is a challenge. We've been trying to experiment in the last year or so at Bournemouth to try and build that audience because we felt there is a big opportunity to grow the business audience. And the very word business actually is quite interesting, isn't it? Because somebody mentioned earlier on about language is important. We talk about business coverage and that turns a lot of people off, but actually business is about jobs, it's about prosperity, it's about people, and therefore perhaps we need to use different language in business as well. It can be a bit of a turn-off to people. Some business coverage looks after itself almost. So, for example, a couple of examples of the last week or so: Marks and Spencer closing stores. The big anchor store of Marks and Spencer's closed in Bournemouth about 2 months ago. It's a huge blow to the town. That story obviously did incredibly well, tens of thousands of page views. Toys R Us, similar story. We have a JP Morgan in Bournemouth. 4,000 people work there, so when we do a JP Morgan story, that's phenomenal on the website as well. We have an airport, and we have Ryanair at the airport. Every time you put a Ryanair story up or Ryanair in a story, that's phenomenal as well. So we do a lot of that kind of thing, and that does look after itself. However, the day-to-day coverage of business is more problematical, partly because we know traditionally that businesses want to talk about what they want to talk about rather than what perhaps the reader wants to talk about. And that's a bit of a culture change to get them to engage with us more and be more open about their businesses. So we revamped our business coverage last year on the basis that the general coverage, nobody was reading it apart from those big stories with the big names in it. So we introduced some new platforms looking at the data as to what people wanted to read. So we started a Monday Startup. People want to know about businesses that are starting, how they've started up, how is it possible to start a business in difficult times. We introduced a Wednesday Boss profile, so a good look at somebody who is running a successful company, and we introduced the Friday Digital platform, which is obviously in Bournemouth. Bournemouth is a real hub for digital enterprise and new companies. So we're looking at that as platforms. Our business editor promotes his stuff on social media, and he also does a written weekly digest for LinkedIn, providing full links to all the stories that he's done in the week. And we've learned quite a lot of lessons actually about how we're doing things. I just mentioned that, but we've learned a lot of things about how people want to engage with us, want to engage with the business community. So, for example, we know that stories involving brand names that you will probably have heard of, even though they're localised to our area, like Lush and Sunseeker and Farrow and Ball, perform really, really well, especially when married to the word Brexit. And Brexit, believe it or not, we probably think people are sick of the word Brexit, but Brexit stories do incredibly well. So, for example, a story about Lush expanding its production in Germany rather than in Poole after the referendum attracted 83,000 page views. Lush's decision to become a living wage employer attracted 17,000 and a lot of comments, which were at variance actually with the opinions of the boss. Stories about JP Morgan regularly 20, 30, 40,000. Not every story about famous brand names attracts that kind of level, but they're almost always read in their thousands. The Friday digital platform has a relatively small readership, but it does best when it features stories about apps and new innovations, which is good. And when I say it's a small audience, those stories would, or that business coverage would have been in the hundreds previously, and now those stories are in the 2, 3, 4, 5,000s, which, you know, is relatively small, but actually in terms of building that business audience, which is what this is all about, that's really quite important. Stories about small businesses with a compelling narrative do well. And I've got an example. We had a story about an immigrant who sold ice creams on Bournemouth seafront while saving up enough money to open a fashion store in Poland, and that had about 20,000 page views. And a young man who started a fashion brand while at sixth form had about 10,000 page views. I don't want to bombard you with figures, but what we've learned is that it does show that if you target the right stories and it has a compelling narrative, and it's the story that people want to read, then that will do really well. And the last thing I would say, and again it was a point that was made by the lady from Chartbeat earlier on, that you have to put effort into it, you have to put time into it. I have a business editor, and lots of papers don't have a full-time business editor anymore. We've decided to keep ours because we think it's a really important area commercially, editorially, and for audience building. And he puts a lot of time into these stories. He goes out and sees people, and that sounds fairly basic, but a lot of people stop doing that. And the only way this will work is if we invest time, effort, and energy into telling those stories. And it's the same principle as in news, but I think it's working well. It's a good experiment, and it's certainly showing that we can build the audience bit by bit. That's it. Thank you. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that. I've had some questions on Slido, and panel members have all got a microphone on their seats. So I'll just go through them here. It's worth mentioning before I start these questions, there's been a couple of questions for me after I dropped the shorthand bomb, which I'm totally expecting, but I don't want to step on the toes of the panel, so please come and grab me to unleash your hatred on me later. I can cope. I used to be a court reporter, so I've had people screaming in my face lots of times. And that was in the newsroom, and then I went to court and covered court cases. Right, okay. So, one question here is, you mentioned Google and Facebook acquisition trends. Have you any data showing, oh sorry, that's, I can't see properly. Yeah, sorry. Scrolled up. Yeah, sorry. One to Anna. So someone's asking, if reporters are writing about passions and you take the slants on national stories, isn't there a danger of losing your traditional geographical audience?
Yes.
Is that on? Are we on?
Any better?
Yeah.
Well, the passions and the patches are all designed to be areas of content where there is a audience need. So they are all really local issues. It's from anything from geographical areas where we know there's a really strong social community, or areas where we know that there's a lot of search traffic, i.e. the city centre, or it's other areas of content that we know there's a lot of need for, so transport being one of those. Clearly that's something that's local, and then other more issue-based important things for Birmingham, like homelessness and poverty. So they are all very local and relevant things, and what's important for us, parenting is one of them actually as well, which I mentioned, which is what's important to us is that we start to build communities around those, and ways to engage with people that are sort of not just throwing out pieces of content. So parenting is a really good example of that, where we've built up social pages. There's a Facebook page specifically for our parenting platform called Brummy Mummies, which is all about engagement, and that has now sort of spilt into an area where people are meeting in real life. There are social events. We run events for that community, so it's more around actually the concept of patches and passions are entirely about the local and law audience and around how to grow communities. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And a question for Andy Martin. And this questioner has asked that, said that they agree on the opportunity for business, but are our main news brands, for the main brands, is news the best place for it, or is there a chance for a vertical site with a paywall and premium ads?
Relating specifically to business or to...
Yeah.
Certainly our business coverage, we try and we put in our news channel because it is news and we make it newsy. So yes, that's the first point. And the second point, not entirely sure. Trying to get money out of business is quite a tough thing these days. So you'd need to look at the commercial aspects of that. But I think it's certainly an idea. It's certainly a potential idea. But I would. The issue of paywalls is very controversial, and with my editorial director here, I think I'll be careful what I say. All right, Toby? Yeah? All right. Yeah, I'm getting a lift home with him, so I've got to be careful.
That's all the questions we got on Slido, but has anyone got any questions here that they want to ask any of our panel members? Go ahead, David.
We have front page editors, so everyone is using these tools. So we have front page editors, and actually at the start of the year, that was my job before I didn't start this job until April. And yeah, you are looking at how things are performing. We'll use things like Chartbeat, heads-up display, and then Telescope to sort of drill into those stories in the way that I showed you. And then we've got an audience engagement team that, if you've got a big breaking story or a story that's getting really an unusual amount of traffic, they'll be coming to you suggesting, SEO and that sort of thing. Does that answer? Is that what you mean?
I'm just interested in the mechanics. Do they edit copy at all, or do they just focus on tweaking the copy and making sure the picture's great?
So if you're front page editor, yeah, you are focused on things like that. You're not subbing it. There's someone else subbing it, but you are sat sort of 3 seats down on the same desk from them. So it's a conversation. So you very much focused on how is that index pick working, and what's my engagement and that sort of thing. Yeah, it's an overview rather than a hands-on subbing role.
Okay, I've got a really good question here, actually, generally to anyone in the panel, actually, because I think this is any one of you could answer this. And it is, might reporters feel concerned if they cover a specialism that isn't a high traffic driver? So we know sport and crime do big numbers, but business perhaps doesn't. So just wondering, because we have touched on sort of coaching and speaking to reporters in the newsroom and one-to-ones, etc. So just wondered your thoughts on that. Anyone? Yeah. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, so exactly to the point that I was making in my presentation, actually, that one of the great things about having lots of different metrics now is that really we should be tailoring those to those types of conversations. So often I think it has to be a really sort of holistic approach in terms of analysing what's good performance and what isn't good performance. I don't think the big blunt figures always are the right thing to measure performance for in those cases. There are often, I know, especially with our reporters, there are things that they're doing in terms of social that are really sort of moving the dial or really sort of starting to mobilise an audience, that they're in an area where they're never going to get the same numbers as a big live story, and there are certain stories that will always move many more page views than things that we have to work harder to get an audience to. But I think that's more about selecting the right type of things to mark those against, and also just having a really sort of wide view of what the performance is and what metric to use.
Yeah, thank you, Rita.
I was just going to add that this Friday we're relaunching all our entertainment's coverage as something else. We're branding it something else, and we're making it much more in paper and much more hopefully engaging for our online audience as well. So if reporters are concerned about the fact that the stuff they do is low traffic stuff, well, actually what we're trying to do, as we prove with business, is to raise that. So in my newsroom, the answer would be no, they needn't be worried, because actually we're trying to build the audience across the whole spectrum of what we cover, not just sexy news.
Following on from that, if I can, because it kind of links to it, is a question saying, how do you motivate reporters to look at stats, because everyone seems very busy? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, is it? Are we on?
This one's
on.
So actually I had a chat yesterday about this, and I think one of the keys to it is drilling down the figures. So I think most news will put out a list each day of the top stories and top engaged stories, but it's really making sure that you highlight stories that have done well for other reasons. So stories that have had high engagement, high social traffic, lots of people commenting on stories on social, on the website, and making sure that those, because a lot of hard work might have gone to a story that got 2,000 page views, but it's got a really engaged audience. We know the audience is going to come back. The audience love that story because they shared it on their Facebook pages. So I think that's the key to me is, as mentioned earlier, is really going down to make sure that each department gets their own different analytics. So if you work for the news team, or if you're covering Leeds United, for example, you know that your stories are going to drive huge figures. But if you work for the features team, you might have been out and done a 3-hour interview but about a beautiful house in Yorkshire, for example. We might have got 3,000 page views, but we know that audience is also really commercially important, because there might be homeowners, they're looking for new houses. So there's many different reasons why a story is successful. So I think finding the motivation isn't just about saying, go and get more page views, because that will be demoralizing. It's really praising when stories do well for individual reasons.
Yeah, of course you can.
Great. So part of my role is to do education on Chartbeat tools. And I think what's really worked for me when talking to reporters specifically is showing them just data related to their byline. So if you can drill down, as you were saying, to give them the exact slice that they have influence over, that's incredibly motivating. But when you tell someone, go and get more page views, the first question is, well, how do I do that? And that's not really what their journalistic aim is anyway. So if you tell them, make your content as engaging as you possibly can, which will ultimately just lead to the page views as the end outcome anyway, I find that that is much more aligned with the aims of the journalism, the metrics, and sort of everything we're collectively working towards.
Brilliant. I've got a couple of questions actually for Ashley, so it's good that you've got the mic in your hand still. The first one is, do you see a lot of common themes in how newsrooms measure quality, and is there a standout newsroom that gets the most out of Chartbeat to improve?
So I'm not saying this because they're here today, but I absolutely love working with Reach. I am consistently impressed by how thoughtful they are with the metrics that they've chosen. Specifically, I'll cite the high impact articles that Anna mentioned. So I work closely with David Higgerson, who I'm not sure is in the room, but him and I chat a lot about what does good mean for a particular story. So what is the baseline for the stories for maybe, the education section? What kind of metrics are they already achieving, and how can we set an incremental goal ahead of that, whether it's a combination of page views, uniques, and weighting that quality metric, the average engage time metric, or loyalty, for example, page views that came from loyal visitors. Like I said, I'm consistently impressed by how sophisticated they are, and really how they communicate that out to a wider team. There is a Data Digest newsletter that goes out that I also receive from David, which I love reading, and it's really keeping everybody informed. And I think those who get the most out of the metrics are the ones who have kind of the top-down leadership understanding what's important, and then their peers as well reinforcing that on a daily basis.
Right, well, that's all we have time for here on this panel. I'm sure lots of interesting discussions that we can have over lunch and so on. But thank you very much for taking part, and thanks to everyone on the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.